randomly picked, well, not randomly, but the two artists who both went to Italy and were influenced by Italy and their Italian art, but neither of them were Italian. And they both reacted in completely different ways to their experience. And they're both major artists, and completely different. I mean, and I didn't think I was going to find anything to link these two artists, but I did find, I ran across a really interesting piece of information, which I won't tell you immediately, but in Italy, there is a link between El Greco and Bruegel the Elder. El Greco and Bruegel the Elder are from around the same period as Caravaggio, a little bit earlier. El Greco is actually the younger, but I'm starting with him because I have more to say about Bruegel than El Greco. But one can't talk about art without talking about El Greco, because he's a major figure, especially in the modern era. He had a profound effect on Cézanne and actually on Picasso. Picasso credits him with being part of the inspiration for Cubism. Anyway, El Greco is born in Crete. He's born, according to everything we know, he's born Greek Orthodox. And during his early years, he trains as a painter of Greek icons, and becomes a master of the icons, and has a workshop of his own. But being an ambitious man, he decides to go to Venice, which he can do easily because the whole Eastern Mediterranean was controlled by the Venetians, and the Venetians ruled Crete at that time. So he could easily pass from Crete to Venice. And he spends a couple of years in Venice, and he's very influenced by Titian. He's also extremely influenced by Tintoretto, who we looked at last time and who's developed mannerism to a very extreme degree. El Greco takes mannerism to an even greater degree. He's the most extreme mannerist that ever existed, actually. Let's go to and take a look at something he did while he was still in Crete, and it's very interesting. So that's an icon, and it's the burial of Mary here, or at least it's more the it's everyone weeping over her and having a funeral, really. But it's clearly in the Eastern tradition. It's quite good in its own way, but it looks to my eyes, after looking at all this high Renaissance art, it looks quite primitive. But actually very intriguing. So he gets to Venice, and his work starts. He's unlike a lot of Greek artists who went to Venice. He starts absorbing the Venetian and Italian influence, and this is a transitional painting. You can still see its relationship to his icons, but his drawings of the figures are getting more convincing and more fully developed in terms of form. And actually a charming little painting, I think. I don't know what other people think of it, but it's very interesting in terms of the way he handles paint and color. So from Venice, he goes on to Rome. And in Rome, he gets to know and become very close to an artist who I'd never heard of before, Clovio, who was actually from the Balkans. So he was also a foreigner in Italy. He's the most famous Renaissance miniaturist, and he basically spread mannerism throughout Europe with his little miniatures that he painted. A very, very accomplished painter, as you can see. He became very close with El Greco, and when El Greco painted a painting to acknowledge the influences. Let's see if this is the right one. No, sorry. When Greco wanted to acknowledge his masters, well, no, this is actually earlier. Sorry, this is during the early period, the late period in Venice. And so let's go on. I'm sorry. Here we are. This is Christ driving the moneylenders out of the temple. I'm not quite sure what these ladies are doing in it. It's based loosely on a drawing by Michelangelo. And he has in the corner here the artists who he considers to be his masters. Titian on the left of this group, Michelangelo behind there, and then Clovio. That's why I got it. I looked up Clovio because I thought, who the hell is Clovio? And Raphael on the far right. Now, it's interesting for a number of reasons. Apart from the fact that he's acknowledging the people who influenced him, he got in a lot of trouble in Rome because he was asked what he thought of Michelangelo, who at this point was dead, by the way. But he said, well, Michelangelo was a good man, but he couldn't paint, which didn't go over very well with his patrons in Rome because everyone worshipped Michelangelo at this point. And he also went to the Pope Pius V, and offered to repaint the Last Judgment of Michelangelo. He said he didn't know how to do it. I can do a much better job.
Oh, no.
But in the process, he made a lot of enemies in Rome because he was a little too arrogant at times. He was also he was viewed as very strange. One artist came to visit him in his studio on a bright sunny day, and he comes into El Greco's studio and the windows are closed, the shutters are closed, and it's pitch dark. And El Greco's sitting in the pitch dark, and the artist says to him, well, what are you doing? And El Greco said, well, the daylight disturbs my inner light. So he was searching his inner light in the darkness. A very interesting character, to say the least. But he, having lost his patronage in Rome and feeling he didn't fit in, he decided to head to Spain because Ferdinand II had just gained power, and he thought, well, maybe I can get patronage from the King of Spain. So he heads for Spain, and he's beginning to really come into his own as an artist by this time. This is one of his first paintings that he painted in Spain. You can see it's very accomplished, and it's also starting to exhibit his mature style, where there's form and there's depth, but it's kind of things are flattened and they weave in and out. And he also has that strange, cool, slightly unearthly lighting. Well, Philip II didn't like El Greco's work. He never got any commissions from the royal family, but he did, but he did get a lot of commissions for churches. So he stayed in Spain, and he ended up actually dying in Spain. Not ever really as appreciated as he would be in the modern era. This is one of his mature works and one of his most spectacular works, actually. And there's an interesting, it's interesting how he, you know, in a lot of the Baroque art and the Mannerist and Baroque art, the people in the heavens were treated the same way as the people on earth, which I always found a little bit weird and confusing. But he's definitely making a distinction, as in fact Tintoretto did in some of his paintings, between the heavenly and the earthly. But he's also got this really interesting effect going on up here, of flattening and weaving of surfaces, which is really coming into its own in this painting. And also a very, very strange palette. Mm-hmm. I'm actually, I'm not crazy about him. I'm not crazy about this kind of art, but this is an incredible painting. Mm-hmm. I don't know, what do other people think of it?
Everybody looks like him. They really do.
Yeah. Well, his elongation of people is quite extreme.
Mm-hmm. I think I like this one better than the very first ones you showed me. Dark. They were kind of depressing. I like this a little better, but Wendy's right. It looks like it's his face.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. It's bizarre.
It's bizarre.
Yeah. It's like View of Toledo. I mean, the other paintings that
we're coming to that. Yes, but first, here's a one of Christ before they force him to take off his robes and carry the cross. Mm. Now this is very dark. I mean, but again, you can see the flattening of space. You can see the extreme distortion of figures, which are characteristic of Mannerism, and a certain otherworldliness. But yes, all these long faces.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, these were things that his contemporaries had problems with. And it's one of the reasons he wasn't ever super appreciated in his time.
Well, he doesn't make everything look beautiful. Like, it's quite earthy and just, I don't know, in some ways it's unusual, but it almost feels like it's more realistic in a weird kind of, I don't know if that even makes sense, but.
Well, and you get an experience from him always, a very strong experience. Mm-hmm. So you feel that even if these people are a little bit bloodless, they're very much alive, and they're existing half in another realm almost, which I think he was all the time. But it's a very, I mean, this is a very eye-catching painting. And finally, yes, Julie, when I look at his work, I really wish he'd done more landscapes, because
I mean, that to me is stunning. I've always loved him, but I think I just associate him with this painting.
I like this one.
Yeah.
Well, it has all the qualities of the other ones. It has that weaving of space that, you know, which you can, you know, which, and it's something that the expressionists would really liked. Is something that you see beginning in Van Gogh, actually. You can see that this has some of the characteristics of a Van Gogh landscape in terms of the way it's drawn, the rhythm of it.
Yeah.
The whole thing has a rhythm, you know, and all his paintings have that. And it both has a real sense of depth and a real flatness at the same time, which is very intriguing.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that all the buildings look the same color.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of gives the impression that the moonlight is what's lighting them up.
Yeah, that's true of a lot of his paintings. There's a sense of moonlight in them, even whether or not that was the case.
Yeah.
It's
white,
isn't it?
Now, Toledo was the center of the Spanish Inquisition. And one of the things we do know about El Greco was he was completely in tune with the Counter-Reformation. His art was a testament to the Counter-Reformation. So there's some of the, you wonder, you may be reading it in, but there's something a little haunting and maybe even a little disturbing about this view at the same time that it's incredibly beautiful.
Yeah.
Gorgeous. Yeah.
It's luster, isn't it? Really, in a
Yeah.
landscape.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a version of that. And a lot of his paintings are, though, there's almost an iridescence that enters some of his paintings because of the strange way he uses those hues that are not that intense, but very unusual against darks. Well, now,
The sky reminds me of fireworks right now in the Mission.
oh yeah, yeah. So now we're going to go to a man who's utterly different, but they do intersect at a certain point, and I'll bring that up in a minute. Now, I've done two of him because one of them is presumably, we believe, is a self-portrait here,
Oh, I
with
like these.
with a patron behind him making comments that he doesn't seem to be enjoying very much. And this is a portrait of him after his death. So somewhere between the two is a likeness of Bruegel. I'm not sure where exactly it is. You can see he had a very developed nose in both of them. He has a downward turning mouth, very strong features. He was known as Bruegel the droll. He didn't say a lot, but he had a very good sense of humor, and he liked to play practical jokes on people. And he also, he's known also as the peasant painter for obvious reasons. We don't actually know his background. We don't know if he came from a peasant family, as some people say, or a middle-class family. We just don't know. We know almost nothing about him. Well, actually, I'm going to keep this up for a little longer while I just talk about that. We know nothing about him until he becomes a young artist studying under Peter Cook van Aust. And he works with him for quite a few years until Peter Cook dies, at which point Bruegel joins the Guild of St. Luke's in Antwerp. And this is the first official thing we know about him. So he becomes an official artist at that point, able to do business as an artist. Peter Cook had a wife, second wife, who obviously knew Bruegel very well because later Bruegel will marry her daughter. This woman, whose name is Maiken Verhulst, was considered one of the leading women artists in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, we have none of her work. We have nothing. But she would play a major role in his life, which I'll describe later. But after joining the Guild of St. Luke and becoming an official painter, he immediately leaves for Italy, and he's in Italy for 3 years. And for a long time, we knew nothing about his time in Italy, but people are beginning to be able to reconstruct it, partly using his paintings. So I'm going to jump ahead because this is a painting he did much later, but it's based on his drawings from his trip. It's a view of the Bay of Naples. And on the right-hand side, Vesuvius is erupting. There's also a sea battle going on here. When, at the time that he would have been in the south of Italy, the Turks were attacking the southern coast. And he probably witnessed this on a number of occasions. But it's a stunning landscape done from sketches many years later. But it shows how far he traveled. In fact, he went beyond Naples. He went to almost the tip of Italy, we know for sure, because he did. Now, these two drawings I could not get large versions of, unfortunately. So they're a little foggy. But this is a drawing of, we happen to know that's Reggio Calabria at the Straits of Messina. and in southern Italy, and it's on fire. And it's on, we believe it's on fire because at the time he was there, the Turks attacked Reggio Calabria and set it on fire. So he traveled, and he may have gone to Sicily, but we don't know. We know that he went at least this far, which in those days was a real journey. It was a dangerous and arduous journey. So the guy was very adventurous and quite capable. But then he returns to Rome. And this is where we find a sudden link with Clovio. Because who does he hang out with in Rome but Clovio, the same man who 20 years later will become a friend of El Greco. And I suspect, but I have no way of proving it, I suspect that he was given an introduction by Heiken Verhulst, the woman who would become his mother-in-law, because she was an extremely famous miniaturist herself. So there was probably contact between her and Clovio. But Clovio, at his death, in his will, said he had 3 paintings by Bruegel. One of them was a painting they'd both done together. And one of them was a painting of the Tower of Babel, on which Bruegel had painted on ivory. Now, we don't have that, but if you remember Bruegel's work, you know that his Tower of Babel is one of his most famous works. And what's even more interesting is that Clovio was also interested in the Tower of Babel and had painted it on a number of occasions himself. So that's the rather unusual link between these 2 artists. But this gives you some idea, and we're jumping ahead because this is a mature work, but it gives you some idea of just the fertile imagination that this man had, and his ability to create something that is both extremely well composed and full of detail. So in Italy, it's interesting, he did no drawings that we know of Italian masters, but I want to show you this detail from a later painting because it shows that he absorbed mannerism. This is a detail, but these figures, Mary and these other 2 figures, are perfect examples of mannerist figures. So he was quite capable of doing the Italian manner, but he didn't. He went in a completely different direction. And you have to really look to see the Italian influence in his work, which is unusual. Everyone else went full Italian after going to Italy. 2 more paintings that reflect the Italian experience. This one, which is also very characteristic of his work, is called The Fall of Icarus. Can anyone find Icarus in it?
In the water.
In the water, yeah, right.
Just his legs. And not only is this great historical event insignificant in the painting, but the plowman hasn't even noticed it, and the shepherd is looking the other way. The fisherman doesn't seem to pay much attention down here, and the boat is sailing away. But look at this landscape. This has to be an Italian landscape, southern Italian landscape, which of course is appropriate because the story of Icarus is a Greek story and takes place in the southern Mediterranean. But anyway, let's move on to another one, which also shows what this trip did to him, because much later he paints a picture of the conversion of Saul. Remember Saul on the road to Damascus, who's
Oh my God.
persecuting the early Christians, has a vision of Christ, falls off his horse in the blinding light, and converts to Christianity. Where is he in this painting? Can anyone find him? Well, I'll remove the suspense. He's right here.
Where?
Yeah, he's not. And this is one of the things that is, in fact, Bruegel's point of view. Nature is bigger than all of us, and nature is an obsession with him. And man exists within nature, more than in almost any painter that's ever painted. And so, and here, as significant as this army, where one of his leaders is having this vision, is the landscape that they're climbing through. You know, he passed, it's pretty certain that he came back to the Netherlands through the Alps, and they obviously left a huge impression on him. These Alps are very fantastical, but they're also very, very convincing. And look how the figures in the foreground all have their backs to us. It's a very novel view of the world that he's giving us. Well, when he first got back from his long trip, I did want to show you this by contrast. Michelangelo's painting of the same subject. Remember?
Mm.
There's Saul, his horse, but Michelangelo puts Christ in there and a bunch of angels and an incredibly dramatic scene where, because he's now moving into mannerism, he hasn't put Saul in the very center, but he's definitely a central figure in the action.
Mm.
Everyone's responding to him. Though, you know, there is an interesting thing here. Bruegel probably didn't see this painting because it's in the Pope's private chambers, but he did see Michelangelo. And he would have seen the Sistine Chapel. He would have seen other works by Michelangelo when he was in Rome. Look at this figure here in the foreground. It looks a lot like some of Bruegel's figures. You know, he was absorbing, and this one here especially, he was absorbing what he saw there, but he synthesized it. He didn't just slavishly follow the Roman model, you know. But so when he gets back to the Netherlands, for a few years he doesn't paint. He works with an artist called Hieronymus Koch. Hieronymus Koch. And Hieronymus Koch is a printmaker who makes a really fabulous living selling prints. And Bruegel's job is to do drawings for him, which were then turned into prints. And Bruegel, who had this outrageous imagination, just churned out things. Some of them were of daily life and some were fantasies like this. And the fantasies drew heavily on Hieronymus Bosch, because Hieronymus Bosch was immensely popular, and anything that looked like Hieronymus Bosch would sell. But in this case, he did such a good job that Hieronymus Koch sold this as an original Hieronymus Bosch, and got a lot more money for it as a result.
Yeah.
But this again shows his amazing ability as a draftsman and his amazing imagination. At times, a very disquieting imagination. And as he gets back in, as he starts to paint again, he really only has about less than 20 years of painting before he dies. Because he dies very young. We don't know how he died. But he's painting stuff which is very much related to Bosch. This is the rebellious angels being driven into hell by St. Michael in the center here. But look how well he's absorbed Hieronymus Bosch. and the fancifulness of some of these figures. I'm not crazy about this kind of work, but I'm totally blown away by his ability here. And even more blown away that he would go from this style of work to stuff that we know him for much better. But let me also show you something that's shows that he could work in something more related to the Italian manner in terms of religious subject. But of course, a little bit, this is interesting because it's not quite the death of the Virgin, but she's on her way there. She's dying. And it's interesting that he treats this very domestic moment a little bit the way Caravaggio did. No angels, no heavenly choirs, just a peasant's home, and the people gathered around her as she's very sick and dying. And in fact, it has a lot of the chiaroscuro that one associates with Caravaggio too, though very different. But what you see in this is not a conventional religious work, and he clearly wasn't conventionally religious. He was a friend of Erasmus, who wrote The Praise of Folly, which was very critical of the Catholic Church, very critical of religious folly in general. So he was an independent who had very much a mind of his own. But then all of what we have seen hardly prepares you for this, in my opinion. Among the truly great landscapes in Western art, and this is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, by the way. It's not particularly big. It's about 3 feet wide, I guess. It's behind glass, unfortunately. But what he was commissioned to paint the seasons, and this is kind of midsummer, late summer. It's the
Harvest.
The grain harvest, yes. But what really is striking about this to me is the combination of an incredible narrative detail with a brilliant and very, very strong composition. The sweep of the corn here, the way it sweeps up to this dark area, the mass of the tree, and then you go down the trunk of the tree and you see this gathering of peasants taking a break. This wonderful figure, totally bushed and lying under the tree here. And then the wonderful distant landscape. This painting, I mean, there's 3 or 4 paintings within this painting. You could crop it and still have a good painting, in 4 different sectors of this painting, but it coheres as a unit just really powerfully. And this all comes out of his imagination and any sketches he made. His figures, you couldn't sketch people doing a lot of this stuff. You had to remember and do it from your head. And he does it brilliantly.
I love his palette. I don't know what it is about his palette. It's so appealing to me. The green and the gold and the red. It's just.
As we go through them, you'll see that he's using the same hues over and over again, but the balance changes radically from painting to painting.
And his usage of white, of the warm colors.
Yes.
Yeah.
And reds as a keynote here and there, but wonderful soft greens and blue greens. And quite a limited palette. I'll look it up, but I once read, I mean, he only used about six or 7 colors. But he uses them just brilliantly. Yeah, I mean, this is a poem in yellow, really, in gold. It's the sun. It makes you think a little of Van Gogh's Sunflowers. It's got the same sort of just sense of the power of
Mhm.
of the sun in it. Well, another season a little later.
Mm.
Lovely painting, and these three women here are just perfect, I think, with going to thresh the, going to rake the hay.
Mm.
But if you look at it, it's the same colors again, but in a very different balance.
Mm. Mhm.
And then autumn coming on, bringing the cattle in from probably from the distant pastures as the weather gets worse, bringing them from the high pastures down because winter's coming. But the sense of the impending storm and the sense of motion here, the wonderful ways he characterized the cattle too. His drawings of people and animals are both, I mean, they're brilliantly done, but they have a certain playful or slightly childlike quality to them that's, I think, very, very effective. And you feel so much like you're part of this world. Remember, no one else painted the peasant world to this extent. No one. He preserved a whole way of life which had existed for hundreds of thousands of years and which now is utterly gone. But at the time was the culture of these countries. But no one else thought to paint it. Everyone else wanted to paint paintings of wealth and power and luxury. Almost everyone else. And finally, winter. And again, along with the one of, the first one I showed you of these landscape paintings, just an absolutely stunning landscape. Where the way he's silhouetted the hunter, it's called The Hunters in the Snow, the hunters and their dogs coming back from the hunt is just, you know, I mean, what a, Cassandra, don't you think that this is graphically just amazing?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, the silhouetting of these figures and these trees.
Yeah.
And by silhouetting them, this incredible contrast here, they're really in the foreground. And this subtler treatment back here just falls back. So you get an incredible sense of distance in this painting. And the cold. And his wonderful use of birds. His bird, the birds are in almost all of his paintings. He obviously loved birds. And then look at the work, or the detail of the frozen lake here with the houses. It's just, there's so much information in here done with such simplicity. So that when he painted that, it was the coldest winter they'd had in like a century. He also painted this painting, which shows that he did a lot of paintings on this kind of subject matter. This is the only one. This is The Massacre of the Innocents. But, you know, the story when Pontius Pilate orders his troops to kill the young children because one of them is going to become a king. And in this case, the soldiers are Spanish soldiers and German mercenaries who were occupying the lowlands at the time because of Philip II of Spain. And he paints this picture. It's clearly a criticism of the occupation, which he doesn't like and which most of the lowlanders didn't like. But there's a really weird story to this painting. If you look, where are those little babies? And where is the blood in the snow from them? Well, it was there in the original painting, but then this painting came into the possession of Philip II. And he ordered his painters to paint over all the babies. So all these little bundles you see were originally babies. And so instead of Philip's army massacring innocents, they're now just plundering the houses for bundles of God knows what. Anyway, it's clear that, you know, where Bruegel's sympathies lay, I think, when you see a painting like this. So he also did a whole bunch of, I guess you'd call them genre paintings, of which this is one of my favorites.
Was it common
you
for
probably all know this painting.
artists at that time to create fantasy paintings, like the ones you showed earlier, like the print art?
Well, yes, because of Hieronymus Bosch, actually, and because he was so popular, there was a whole kind of flowering of fantasy work as a result of Hieronymus Bosch. But what Bruegel does with it that's interesting is he takes that quality of fantasy and he applies it to everyday life and the earthy depictions of everyday life. He was known, all we do know is that he had a friend, and the two of them, later in life when he was a well-known artist, the two of them would dress up in peasant clothing and collect a whole bunch of presents, and they'd go to weddings and pretend they were guests and give them presents and party and dance and drink with all the people at the wedding. This is one of the things he liked to do. But this one, I mean, what's interesting to me about this painting is it's the blind leading the blind. And of course, the first one has fallen in a creek that he wasn't aware of. The second one's following him. This one is about to go into. What's interesting is that the spire of the church is right above the hand of this man who's being led into the creek, which I suspect might be a commentary on the church by a kind of a hidden commentary on the church by Bruegel, but I don't know. But it's there in a very significant location. But it's not just that such a vivid, incredibly vivid illustration of that saying, the blind leading, about the parable of the blind leading the blind, but it's also very empathetic. You at the same time you're kind of repelled by these guys, you also feel sorry for them, you know. This was an artist who really had a very broad and empathetic imagination. The colors here too, the colors, there's this green, yellow, violetish hue, which has a kind of off-putting quality. It's very different from some of the other engaging paintings that he's done. And so here's something that he would probably have visited and engaged in. The peasants dancing in the streets to celebrate some holiday. But what a amazingly, but here, okay, here his figures are getting, in the last painting too, the figures are getting much bigger and more dominant in the paintings. And I sense the influence, distant influence of Italian art here, in the way he's able to handle these large figures and in motion and compose them in a very effective way. But it's totally his own manner, you know. It doesn't look Italianate at all. And here the reds have really become dominant, which is kind of in keeping with the party atmosphere and the drunks.
That woman on the woman on the lower left with, I think, a child.
Yeah.
It looks from proportion with the guy that's sitting there. He looks like a giant.
Yeah, well, what I think, because he's, his scenes of peasant life are fairly realistic. This is probably someone who is, in fact, very small. That's what I suspect, unless there's some other meaning that I'm not getting. Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. It's very interesting. But you know, he's very interested in strange types. He's not someone who goes around flattering people at all, including himself. He's got this droll, very objective eye. And here, of course, one of his favorite subjects, and one of the favorite, I think most people just love this painting. It's a peasant wedding with the bride here. And you can see him, it's his regular palette, but he's increased the intensity of the colors, and the reds and the yellows have become very dominant. But what a warm and engaging atmosphere he's created here. And don't you want to grab a plate? I mean, and try the food? I mean, it actually, you can almost smell and feel this place. And the guy pouring wine over here. Wonderful little details. The kid,
little person in the foreground again.
yeah, who's got hold of one of these plates and licking it. Yeah, I mean, you know, to me, he's one of the greatest artists who ever lived. He's, in my mind, he's on a par with Michelangelo and Leonardo and all of those. And he also takes he has such a unique point of view. I mean, the fact that he died in his 40s is just kind of heartbreaking. God knows what he would have continued. This is his last painting that we know of. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's even finished, actually. But it's kind of interesting that this is his last painting. Before he died, we don't know what he died of. Some people think he was killed because of his political opinions. We don't know. But we do know that he asked his wife before he died to destroy some of his work because he thought it would get her in trouble. Because they were under occupation, and the Spanish were utterly brutal. It was very dangerous. He may have been killed as a result of his opinions. There's just no information. So what happened? He died, and he left an 8 and a 4-year-old son, who later became leading painters. How did they do that? Because he never trained them. It was his mother-in-law, Maken Verholst, who trained them. And the younger one, who was named Peter, proceeded to spend the rest of his life doing copies of his father's paintings and some variations on them as well, and helped really to spread his father's name throughout the rest of the lowlands and further. He did very good copies. We can't always tell the difference. We're not always sure what's from Bruegel's hand and what's from his son's hand. And his younger son, Jan, actually ended up collaborating with Rubens, who we will look at later. But his story is as intriguing for what we don't know as for what we do know. Especially, he's the kind of person like Shakespeare that you want to know more about them because they're just so deep and so interesting in their work. You want to know more about their life, but we just don't. Maybe it's a good thing, you know, maybe we're not distracted from his work. But any final reactions to him and his work?
That's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's
Love it.
gorgeous.
Just
Very varied, like very different.
It's true. He's got an incredible variety to his work, and you realize he could easily have become another Italianate artist if he wanted to.
Mhm.
But he could have probably got a lot more famous and wealthy if he'd focused on the kind of subjects that the wealthy were really interested in. Fortunately, he had some enlightened patrons, but he never became super famous or super wealthy because of his subject matter. And after his death, he's he was kind of largely forgotten, because is that Maria waving goodbye? It looks like it.
No, Wendy. I'm telling Wendy goodbye.
Oh, okay. He was like, it was really like El Greco. He was rediscovered a little bit earlier. He's rediscovered by the Barbizon school, by Corot and Courbet, who also are interested in similar subject matter. And I think, I suspect that Gauguin was very influenced by him. But I
Bye,
don't.
Julie.
See, oh, okay. Bye, everyone. See you next week.
Okay.
And thank you, Cassandra.
Everybody's
Thank
talking
you.
now. Okay, bye, Anthony. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
See you next week.
Yeah.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Oh, Anthony,
Yes.
that's it. I sent you a reply to your email, and I'd like your opinion on this. So get back to me when you can.